Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph, and we will be learning today Emir Hashem Daf Nun Daled Amid Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Tefillin. We are still in Siman Lamed Beis, although we are slowly but surely drawing towards the end of this very complex Siman about the manufacture, the writing, and the manufacture of the Tefillin. We're holding on Nun Daled Amid Aleph Siman Lamed Beis in the midst of Siman Mem. So yesterday we learned about the need for the bottom to be black, and now we are second line from the bottom of the Shulchan Aruch, last word in the Mechaber. Chritz shebein bayis labayis. We know that the Tefillin Sharosh are comprised of four individual bottom, and here we could see you have one bias, a second bias, a third bias, and a fourth bias, and you see the line in between. Now I'm showing you the line on the top of the bias. If I go like this, you can see that that line is actually on the front of the bias as well. We have the three lines that delineate the four bottom, and we have it on the back of the bias as well. We also have those lines that show us the four bottom. So that's the halacha that the Mechaber discusses right now. He says, Chritz shebein bayis labayis. That space that is between each one of the bottom, tzarich sheyagia ad hatefer. That line has to go all the way down until the tefer. What's the tefer? The tefer are the tfiros, the stitches that we've learned about. See, all the stitching here on all four sides. So on the front of the bias, at the titura, we have a line of stitching, right? Hold it like that so you can see the line of stitching down there. That is on the titura. The lines that separate the bottom have to go down all the way until the tefer, all the way down until the tfiris. So it's not enough to just have lines here on top that show us the four bottom. We have to have lines on the front and on the back, and those lines have to go all the way down the ketzitza, all the way down the bias proper, all the way down until the tfiris, until the stitches that go through the titura. Continues the Mechaber on the bottom line. V'him lo yigia, if they don't go all the way down to the titura, kishera, the tefillin are still kosher. V'hu sheyiyah niker hacharitz, as long as the chritz is recognizable, kedei sheyiyu arbas rosheha nirin lakoil, so that the four tops of the bottom should be recognizable to everyone. And the point over here seems to be that on the Shalrosh, it has to be very recognizable on the Shalrosh that the Shalrosh is comprised of four bottom. So again, we have the line of separation, and we're going to see it's not just a line. Remember, each one of these is actually a separate bias. Each one of these is its own rectangular bias, and there are interior walls inside that divide the four compartments. So this is not just one bias, as we're going to learn soon. This is not just one bias with lines cut to, make it look like there are four compartments. These are actually four bottom that are compressed together. And that line is just, it illustrates the nature that it's four different pieces. So really, those lines are supposed to be visible on top and on front and on back, and they're supposed to go all the way down to the Makam HaTefer. The Mechaber says that if you didn't do it all the way down, as long as it's Niker HaCharitz, as long as we can discern the lines so that the four tops of the bottom are recognizable as four individual bottom, then B'di'eved, the Mechaber said it is kosher. Now let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah back on Nun Daled Amud Aleph. We start with Ois Katan. Ois Katan Kof Pei Zayin. The Mechaber said, V'hu sheyeh niker hacharitz, that the charitz has to be recognizable. Avalim einoi niker mi bachutz, But if that line of separation is not visible from the outside, despite the fact that on the interior of the bias it is 4 separate batim, and each one of the 4 individual parchments of the shalrosh are inserted into 4 different compartments, loy mahani, that is not effective and the bias is not kosher. In order for the bias to be kosher, it has to be 4 batim and it has to be recognizable mibachutz. It has to be visible from the outside that it is divided into 4 separate batim. Kof bechetz nikar hachritz. The chritz has to be recognizable. Aval srita oirishima ba'alma. But if all the line is a scratch or an impression that you made in the leather, loy mahani klal, that's useless. The nature of these lines of separation are not that the batemacher took a knife and cut and made a line. It's because they are 4 separate batim. That's why there's a line. And that's what the Mishnah Berurah is stressing to us over here. He's saying it's not enough to go make recognizable lines by virtue of scratching it out or pressing it in with something. No, it has to be because that is the chritz, that is the space that is created by the fact that they are 4 separate batim. And the Mishnah Berurah continues on Nundal Amud Beis, Ki al kol panim tzarich hevdol ma'at bein habatim, because there has to be a tiny bit of separation between the 4 batim. Sheyu acharitzim nikarim mamish, so that those spaces are very recognizable. V'chein achayodam the me'ein b'maisa hasofrim, the chayodam protested against what some batim machers would do, shemedapkin habatim, where they would glue the batim together, v'tochin es kol habayis b'tiach. What some sofrim, he says, would do is, they would take the 4 batim, they would compress them together, use glue in between the individual batim to hold them tight together, then they would smear some kind of a wax or some kind of a like almost like a plaster on the outside of the bias and make them completely smooth. And then rak she'osid roishem bahaglantz, and then in the wax they would make an impression of lines. So the lines weren't because of 4 batim. The 4 batim they would compress together and they would glue them all tight together. Then they would smear something on the outside of the bias that would make the bias absolutely smooth, so it would look sort of like a shalyad. Then they would take a knife and they would scratch lines to make it look like there were 4 batim, even though there really are 4 batim inside. But by virtue of the way they manufactured it, you couldn't tell that there were 4 batim, so they would take a knife and they would scratch lines. And the Chayyodam protested against that. And remember, we said that we need really that gap should go all the way down to the tfiris. He sends us to the Bir Halacha, where the Bir Halacha has a discussion over here about using glue between the batim. We see that the Chayyadam was not happy with using glue between the batim. The Bir Halacha, the Chavetz Chaim, suggests that maybe it would be okay to use a certain amount of glue, not near the top, but all the way down in the bottom, between the bottom, in the middle, to put in a certain amount of glue to hold it together, because he's afraid that if you don't, eventually the bottom are going to spread apart and you're going to lose the ribua. The bottom are no longer going to be square. But certainly to put glue all the way up and throughout, to glue them together, that he's not happy with. The Choshken HaSeifrim Cheterlin Or Al Harba Batim. Then the Chavetz Chaim brings down that there were some Seifrim who, after the bias was manufactured, they would actually take small pieces of leather and they would cover over the entire bias on all 4 sides with sheets of leather. So now, definitely the chritz is not going to be recognizable. You're covering everything over. And then, v'roishbin by charitzin besakin, then they would take a knife and scratch out lines. Shetia nira karba bottom, the puzzle. That's certainly puzzle. And the Chavetz Chaim says not only is it puzzle, dal yidei zeh naset tefillah shal yad. See, what the Chavetz Chaim is saying is like this. If you imagine if what you did was you made a shel rosh, you know the plastic slip cover that we have on the shel yad? I'll pull one out right now. We have a plastic slip cover, right, that most people use to put on the shel yad. Imagine if you made such a slip cover, but you made it out of leather. So it's like you made a leather box that's open on the bottom. Now you'll take the shel rosh and you'll slip that cover over the shel rosh. Well, if you look at this side now, what does it look like? It looks like a shel yad. Not only that, the Mishnah Berurah says that by doing that, you actually would be making it a shel yad. Why? Because by virtue of the fact that you're taking a leather box and you're boxing the entire shel rosh in one leather box, so now all of the parshas, even though the parshas inside are in 4 individual batim, but now you put one bias over the whole thing. So now all 4 parshas are in one bias. It's all enveloped in one bias. So he says essentially you would be turning the shel rosh into a shel yad. And indeed, the halacha is brought down if somebody would be stuck in a situation where he did not have a shel yad, and all he had was 2 shel roshs. They actually give this eitzah. If all you have are 2 shel roshin, they say make a leather box and put one leather box over one of the shel rosh, and now you'll turn that shel rosh into a shel yad, and now presto, suddenly you have a shel yad. So he says certainly you can't do that. Okay, now we go to Sif Mem Aleph. Oirech v'roichav habatim. The length and the width of the batim, we've said that you need ribua, that they have to be square, so the length and the width have to be precisely equal, but we didn't give a share. Usually when we talk about mitzvahs of this type, right? A lulav has to have a minimum share. There's a minimum share and a maximum share. An esrog, minimum share, maximum share. What's the minimum share of the size of a bias, and what's the maximum share of the size of a bias? So it's very interesting. The Mechaber says, Oirech v'roichav habatim, the length and the width of the batim, the gavan and the height of the batim, ein lo share. There is no share. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Oirech v'roichav, will become hakim. Nevertheless, despite the language of the Mechaber here, the Mishnah Berurah says, Nachain lachush l'divrei ha'ga'onim, it would be proper to concern ourselves with the words of the Ga'onim, shesoivrin, who hold, shalachatchila lo yasa oisan kitanim me'etzba'ayim al etzba'ayim. Lechatchila, we should not make the batim smaller than 2 etzba'os by 2 etzba'os. An etzba is approximately 2 centimeters. So you're talking 4 centimeters by 4 centimeters, right? And that's with the titura. V'hainu im hatitura. 4 centimeters by 4 centimeters with the titura. This pair of tefillin over here, which is an old pair of tefillin, this pair of tefillin is, this pair of tefillin is 4 3/4 centimeters with the titura. When I say with the titura, I mean this measurement. Let's do it this way. Remember what we learned, that the titura begins at the flat side of this notch. So that's where the titura begins, and it ends obviously over here. So the titura is about 4 3/4 centimeters. Right? Did I get that right? It is... it's really 5 centimeters. So this is 5 centimeters with the titura. And he's saying over here that you should not make it smaller than 4 centimeters. If it would only be 1 etzba by 1 etzba with the titura, that's mamish tiny. You're talking 2 centimeters. That's like that. 2 centimeters with the titura. That would be tiny, tiny, tiny. Afilu b'di'evet pasal, that would be pasal even b'di'evet. V'chein pasak b'sefer ber Mordechai. V'ayin b'sefer el Yerabah shalimid aleim schus. He's a malamed schus on some people who had very tiny tefillin. When we come up, nevertheless see him, he concludes, the chol bal nefesh yizayar lases hatitura rachav shtei etzba'ayim, that a bal nefesh should make sure that the titura is at least 2 etzba'is wide, so that would be 2 etzba'is by 2 etzba'is. Olevad kal elu, and besides any other reasons that we have to prevent you from making the tefillin too small, motzi ma'oid be'elu ha-tefillin aktanim, if you're going to try to make tefillin that are that tiny, it's very common sheparshi yosein gerua isad ma'oid, that the quality of the parshas would be very, very inferior because of the need of the cipher to write such tiny parshas. Mitzad doichik hamokim, kasher be'enai re'isi harbe mehem. Chavetz Chaim said he saw many of these tiny parshas that simply were no good. Al kein asher menavsho yishama mehem. Okay, now we go to Sif Ben Beis. We know that on the 2 side walls of the Shel Rosh, on each one we have a shin. On one side, we have a shin that has 3 tops. On the other side, we have a very interesting shin. We have a shin with 4 tops. Says the Mechaber, Shin Shel Tefillin, the shin that's on the bias of the Shel Rosh, halacha l'Moshe miSinai, it is given to us as a halacha l'Moshe miSinai, sheyaseh ba'ar abatim Shel Rosh kimin shin, that out of the leather of the bias of the Shel Rosh, we should form a shin, boletes, that is sticking out, mikimte ha'or, and it is made from the folding of the leather. Echad miyaminai, one on the right side of the bias, of echad mismailai, one on the left side of the bias. Shel yamin hameniach, the shin that goes on the right side of the wearer, shel shloisha roshim, should have 3 tops. V'shel smoil hameniach, and the shin that's to the left of the wearer, shel arba roshim, should have 4 tops. Hagah, the Rambam says, miyu im hipech, if you reversed them, so that you put the shin with the 4 on the wearer's right side and the 3 on the wearer's left side, einay nifsal, it's not possible. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the need to make this shin is based on halach l'Moshe miSinai. V'em diskalkal shin, if the shin gets ruined over the course of the years, ve'einay nikar, and it's no longer recognizable, tzarech l'sakdei mechadash, you have to make a new shin. Dumya im diskal al ribua hamavur b'samach. If you remember, we learned that the need of the bottom to be meruba, to be perfectly square, is also based on halacha l'Moshe miSinai. And over there we said that if you lose the ribua, if the tefillin become bent or twisted and you don't have the ribua, you have to redo the ribua. Why? Because it's halacha l'Moshe miSinai. It's a requirement. Midaraisa. So too the shin on the Shel Rosh is a requirement. Midaraisa, based on halacha l'Moshe miSinai. So if it gets worn out and you no longer can see the shin, you have to redo it. This is very, very interesting. If you take a look at the shin on this bias over here, it's a shin that is styled and formed very much in the style of a shin that you would find in a Sefer Torah. It's a shin written, it's not written, it's engraved, not engraved, it's pressed out, but it is in Ksav Ashuris. It's an Ashuris shin. You can even see it's got the tagin, it's got the little crowns on top of the, right? Got the little crowns over there on top of the leftmost rush of the shin. So it's like a Ksav Ashuris that you would find in the Sefer Torah. Apparently in the older tefillin it was common that the shin did not look like this. It was just, the basic form of a shin. Maybe 3 sticks going to a base. But it wasn't like a sefer written Ksav Ashuris shin. It was just the basic form of a shin. And says the Chavetz Chaim here, Umashma b'achronim, it's implied in the words of the Achronim, the Tmunas Shinin Shalanu, the basic forms of the shin that we have, Shanu Oisin b'tefillin, that we make in our tefillin, Dai is sufficient. The loy be'inon dafka ksav stam mamish, because you don't need mamish, a shin that looks like ksav stam, that looks like ksav ashuris, like it would be in a Sefer Torah tefillin or mezuzahs. Ela dugma, all you need is a basic form of a shin. Or minig seifrim kayoim be'ezem kaimais. However, it became the minig of some seifrim in certain places lahader, to make it muhuder. So he says it is a hidur. V'la asoisan b'ksav ashuris mamish, and to make it like this, mamish ksav ashuris. The Mechaber said that the shin should be biletes. It should be sticking out, and it should be, and you can see over here, this is raised, so it's sticking out, it's protruding. And he says it should be made mikimpte ha'or, by folding the leather. Now, the implication of that is that you would take like a needle nose plier or something like that, and you would pinch the leather so that you fold the leather and you create little areas of the leather sticking out by way of like pinching it and pulling it forward. And that's how you would shape the shin. It's kimin shin biletes. It's a protruding shin mikimpte ha'or, from the folding up of the hide. Says the Mishnah Berurah Kotzadik Beis, v'emasa shin beklaf acher. Let's say you make the shin out of klaf. V'hidbik b'devek alabayis. So you take a little piece of klaf, you make a shin on it, and then you glue it to the outside of the tefillin. Puzzle. That would be puzzle. One of the reasons it's puzzle is because of halakha that we learned previously, which is that the outside of the outermost bias of the shalroish has to be roya pnei hachutz. It has to be exposed to the outside. If you cover it with cloth, it's no longer exposed. Oiskan kutzad gimel. The Mechaber said it should be made mikimpte ha'or, from the folding of the leather. Dahainu, this means shemikame ha'or, that you pinch and fold up the leather b'malakate, with like a plier or a tweezer. Al yidei kfila, it's a method of folding. Shekoifel me'or, where you're doubling up the hide, right? If you have a flat piece of hide, let me show you like this, right? Here we have a tissue. Now the tissue is flat. If I take a plier and I pinch it, right? What am I doing when I pinch it? I'm pulling two pieces together. So I'm making a fold. That's what I'm doing. So he's talking about taking like a plier and pinching the leather together to form a shin. Shekoifel me'ora, that you fold up the leather achenasu si'ifei hashin, until you make the extensions, the branches of the shin. But how about to form the shin by using a press? Dahainu shalad tfus chakuk shin baletes, right? You take a tfus, you take a form, and you make a form of a shin protruding. So let's say you carve it out of wood, and you have a shin protruding from the wood. V'doichik atfus ba'arabayis, and then you push that into the hide, into the leather of the bias, so that you press out a shin. V'nasa tayar shin. Ayin b'taz u'magen avram. He tells us, take a look at the taz of the magen avram. The mashba, where it's implied the lechatchila toiv l'mnoyam izeh, that it would be better not to do it that way. It would be better to make it out of folding it. Ubeknes sagdoyla b'shem tshuvas haramami panu kasav. Dezeu yoser hider. He says adarabba, that doing it with the press is actually more muhder, because you end up with a more beautiful shin. V'chen minig pashut keyayim lahasaysan b'tfus. And the Mishnah Berurah says that the minig nowadays is to use a press. They press out the shin. That's how they make it. Because you make a more recognizable, discernible shin by pressing it out with a press than by pinching it with a pliers. The Mechaber said that you have one shin to the left of the wearer, one shin to the right of the wearer. Shel yamin hameniach, the one that goes to the right of the wearer is the shin with 3 rushim, and to the left of the wearer goes the shin with the 4 rushim. Ve'ein chilik bazeh bein ita la'acher. There's no difference to the lefty or anyone else. The basi yaminu small, the almaz linon. We go by right and left of the world. Kuf tzadikei, if you switch it, einay nifsal. Avalamasa b'shnei atzadim rak shin shel shloisha roshim. Interesting. If you make two shins on the bias shel rosh, but they're both regular shins with three heads, you don't have a four-headed one, oy arba, or you don't have a three-headed one, you only have a four-headed one, puzzle. V'choshkein mechisa legamri shin echad. Certainly, if you leave out one of the shinin, it would be puzzle. I'm going to see, maybe tomorrow we'll discuss a little bit of what's behind this very interesting shin that has four Russian, which we never see anywhere. Okay, a little bit short today. Thank you so much for joining me for Liban HaTorah. It's supposed to Liban HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael, the Baruch should send Yeshua's for voice, Parnasset Shetuchim to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the Biaskel Tzedek, B'meher of Yameinu, Amen. Be well.